In the previous episode, we were talking to Central European writers and about the role of elites. Now, we've invited a writer from Belarus, a writer from Ukraine, and one more, and I'm not sure what to say. Are you from Kosovo or the USA? My first question is for you. You were one of the first journalists to interview Václav Havel in 1989. And it was Václav Havel who became something like the conscience of the people. It is also because he was imprisoned. And it is because of the way he acted before and after 1989. What would you say about the role of writers today? Has the role changed? Unfortunately, it has. And we need to ask why. What we can see in Central Europe, and also in the United States, sadly, is the attempt we could already see in the history. In the unfavorable past of the Soviet bloc and also in Nazi Germany. It is the way the enemies get discredited. The way ideas get devalued. Once someone takes advantage of the general public's ideas and populism to make the rival look worse, and an increasing part of the country can see this rival as something less valuable. This is what we can see in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, perhaps also in Poland and Hungary. This has become a standard tool. Why do Karel Schwarzenberg, Miroslav Kalousek, and other politicians have their reputation like this nowadays? They did not have it before. It is because they are being put down and discredited. This is not about the truth. It is just about putting them down and devastating their reputation. I will now talk personally for a while. When I read my own files made by the communist secret police in the 1980s, I could find that as someone working for the Voice of America in Czechoslovakia, I was a goal for people who were given the task to ruin my reputation and put me down. It was because the members of the secret police did not know what to do. Sure, they tried to bully me, but they did not manage to discredit me. And each of their attempts only improved my position. This is what we can see in contemporary Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary. There are attempts to put down representatives of liberal democracy in all possible ways. And the end of Václav Havel's office as president. He was in Bratislava, and he said that our experience, i.e. our Czechoslovak experience during communism, could be somehow beneficial for the rest of the world. Insisting on what you believe is true and revolting against those who abuse power is something that is worth it. Now, in 2018, this legacy of Václav Havel does not seem to be so fulfilled. At least from Bratislava's perspective. How about from Prague? Yes, there is still something of this legacy alive, especially among those who read and studied Havel. And it is also present outside these four countries we talked about. Havel's books are sold in bookshops in Ukraine, and it is the same in Kosovo, where I lived for 40 years. Havel is still very important, and his reputation is even greater the further you get from Czechoslovakia. There is a lot he has written and said, and many of those ideas are still very important for the contemporary world. And this is why he was so appreciated in Western Europe and the USA after he had been elected. He was not just an ordinary politician who seized the opportunity and wanted to get power. He was welcomed in New York City and Washington in January 1990. I was there and saw this welcome was genuinely warm. Not so many people in the history had it. Unfortunately, the education system in the Czech Republic and other countries in the region does not focus much on the contemporary situation and recent history. The history lessons taught at school typically end up with World War II. Pupils and students do not have a good understanding of what was going on in the totalitarian regimes. They don't even know what happened during the revolution of 1989. And they don't know much about the 1990s either, because this is not part of the school curriculum. These topics hardly ever become a part of the public discussion. When we were fighting Mečiar's government in Slovakia, it was a question whether Slovakia can remain a free country or whether it will stop being a Western country. At that time, people used to say we can choose. Do we want to be part of the West or be like Belarus? It was like a slogan, all of us saying, no, we don't want to be like Belarus. We'll have a Belarusian writer here who left the country to live in Hamburg. Perhaps around the time when we had this simplified idea of Belarus and discussed it in Slovakia. Was living in Belarus so unbearable for a writer that it was necessary to leave? When I was leaving Belarus, it wasn't a kind of treasonable running away from my country. I was quite a young man then. It was 2007. And probably you have heard that in 2006 there was a revolution attempt in Belarus, the Velvet Revolution. But the government and Lukashenko suppressed the protest. How it often happens in Belarus. The time of repressions came and the atmosphere was quite oppressive in the country, in the sphere of culture. At that moment, Western Europe drew attention to Belarus. Several opportunities for Belarusian writers appeared, scholarships from different foreign foundations. Taking into account that I was quite a popular author in Belarus, I received such an opportunity. I moved and in fact discovered Europe. I moved to Hamburg, where I spent more than 6 years. It was a shock for me, as before I hadn't travelled to the West a lot, hadn't known much about it. Life in Hamburg broadened my horizons, opened Europe, and made a European of me, formed my European identity. The Western European, Hamburg libraries, literary festivals, the opportunity to communicate with colleagues from Western Europe changed me a lot. In Hamburg, I've understood that my reader lives in Belarus, that hardly anyone understands me in the West as a writer, because Belarusian history and Belarus are a unique case from the point of view of its culture, history, politics. Then I returned to Minsk. It happened thanks to love. It was a love story. I came to Minsk for a couple of days, met my future wife, and decided to stay in Minsk. I have to mention that in 2013 was a year of prosperity in Belarusian culture. Under Lukashenko and his government, everything happens not so smoothly. First, there are times of repression, then liberalization. 2013 was a year of liberalization. Also, I'd like to mention that in those times, Western Europe, the EU, helped Belarus much, supported its cultural projects, Belarusian opposition, so we were visible in Europe. The present situation and the situation we had in 2013 are two absolutely different stories. It seems that Europe has forgotten about us, because Europe is facing new challenges, which are more important, more terrible, and painful. In Central Europe, we still tend to see Belarus as a country which is simply not free, a country where writers, for example, cannot create freely. But you returned and you live there. Can you express yourself freely? Everything is not so easy. It is difficult to explain it. The point is that in Belarus, until you are directly involved in politics, you live in a cultural ghetto. We, independent Belarusian writers, have our forums, media, festivals. Since we are discussing literature, cultural issues, government understands that we can influence not so much, that we won't bring many problems. But as soon as you leave this area of pure culture or literature and get involved in politics, and I think that literature is a political thing, whether you want it or not, then problems start. I'd say that the main problem is that the Belarusian state tries to ignore independent literature and independent culture, does not let the wide audience have access to it. You won't see the most popular and influential writers on state TV channels. It's forbidden for them to appear there. It's like they don't exist. They're not mentioned in state media. It's difficult and problematic to see their books in the state bookshops. They are kind of pushed out to the periphery, to the margin. The state turns us into marginals, showing that if we cross the line, we will have serious problems. If we just write books, we are not considered by the state as a threat. In Czechoslovakia, before 1989, the situation was as follows. Writers and intellectuals were allowed to do their artistic stuff as long as it was not political. If it touched public life or the regime, their work was prohibited. and some of them were imprisoned. Yet, these people were in the conscience of the people. We knew they were there, and we read their prohibited books. To a certain extent, it contributed to the downfall of the regime. In Belarus, are people like you, writers, artists, intellectuals, recognized by the people? Or are you in a totally marginal position? You know, it seems to me that we all, not only Belarus, live in an unfavorable for the literature time. People do not read much. They read less and less with every year. I see the same situation in the West. You have to make a person read a book. In Belarus, the situation is as follows. A lot of people don't read books at all. I think that educated and cultural layers of the population do hear. You can find books by Belarusian authors only if you want. Our situation is different from that in the Czechoslovakia, for instance, as we have the internet. The emergence of the internet has changed everything. When you are ignored by the state, you can switch to the internet and reach the audience in such a way. I think that at least a certain percentage of the most active Belarusians interact with writers, literature. Is it possible that this group of people will form into some kind of a seed of change in the future? Something Belarus is waiting for? We are touching a rather terrible topic now. The Russian factor is stronger in Belarus than in any other country. We live in a situation where we are constantly overshadowed by Russia. The influence of Russia on Belarus is stronger than on any other post-Soviet country. When we inside Belarus are thinking over this situation, we come to the conclusion that unless Russia collapses into several countries, unless the Putin regime falls, you shouldn't expect any significant cardinal changes in Belarus. Having Russia aside is kind of a curse for Eastern Europe. I don't know whether you realize or not how deep Russian propaganda has gotten into Belarus, into the soul of Belarusian society. The majority of people are poisoned by this propaganda and can't even imagine that reality may be different. People must be waiting for when it is over, when Putin takes control of Belarus. There is such an attitude, and in this case, it's important to what extent the minority, which I represent, will be brave enough to say no. There is this idea, perhaps a cliché, that the harder the situation in the country or the worse the regime, the more important is the position of writers and intellectuals. Much more than in an ordinary society where they only form an ordinary group of people. In difficult situations, the elite is really heard, and people want to know what they think. In Ukraine, there is a war and people are dying. Although not here, but on the borders with Russia. This may sound paradoxical, but for you as a Ukrainian writer, does it make your voice stronger? The role of intellectuals, especially writers, in the life of society is a broad and interesting topic. We experience the same problems as Europe, however, there are some factors that make our situation different. In Ukrainian society, an attitude dominates. Even an axioma, something axiomatic, as a global crisis of institutions. The crisis of trust in institutions makes people search for other reliable sources of information, sources of the truth, sources of sincere words, because everything is distorted, discredited, as it was mentioned. That's why writers are on par with priests at the moment and have a chance to tell important things to the general public. There is no trust in others, no trust in politicians, journalists, businessmen, no trust in anyone. However, there should be trust, at least in someone. And here we, Ukrainian writers, get into a trap, as you have to perform not your direct function, not a function given by our talent, higher power. You can't be just a writer and only write books, but have to convey some basic things, that white is white but not black, that water is wet, the sun shines, the earth revolves around the sun, not vice versa. There are people in Ukraine who still think that it is not the earth that revolves around the sun, but the sun around the earth. Yes, there are such people. All these people need an institution they can apply to. What Alhierd has already mentioned, and that's something we have in common, we are also in a kind of ghetto. Only way to leave this ghetto is social media. My experience proves that at the time of revolution and war, at the time of the rise of national liberal and national democratic ideas, a lot of writers switched to Facebook and wrote simple things that there was a need to explain. Now you're at the stage of the era of imposters. There are a lot of pseudo-experts who often make comments, but their expertise is really questioned. So the writer, in this case, is also a pseudo-expert. Could a writer be required to provide a recipe for healing the country? Or a recipe for political improvement during wartime, for instance? I doubt this. I am very skeptical about this. But certain important things writers can tell. It may happen in a graduated way, caused by some tragic events, like the first killings at Maidan, the so-called Bloody Day of Unity. We were making the Day of Unity in Ukraine when the first killings happened. It was the 19th, the 20th of January, and then after the adoption of the laws of the 16th of January, which were limiting the freedoms, the terror began. The writers then got a feeling that through informal channels they can reach the Western media and tell what was going on. We were screaming in a loud voice because nobody heard us. It seemed that Europe didn't hear us. Our steps were as follows. We were writing letters, recording video messages, asking people to hear us. The situation has changed now. 5 years have passed. I feel cooled down and skeptical. The opinion of writers is less often asked. Maybe it's for the better, as we are getting back into our shell, into our world, and get an opportunity to say other things from this world. Talking about writers, I'm talking about myself, first and foremost. I am an essayist, publicist, but I do not promote any national state ideas, pro-European ideas. I simply say what I want. I think it's the most important when this minimum is provided. When you have an opportunity to say what you want, not what you are expected to say. It seems that we have finally reached this, and it is the most important change that has happened over the last years. You finally have an opportunity to say what you want, but not what society, time, epoch wants you to say. It really matters. As for me, it's a step forward. Of course, one shouldn't forget about one's role, but one also shouldn't exaggerate it. In the previous episode, we discussed the reasons for the rise of populism in Central Europe and the bad feeling and sort of frustration that makes people vote even more populist politicians. You come from the United States. This does not apply to Central Europe only. It is also true for the West, for the USA, looking at the American president, for example. The situation in Central Europe has specific roots, of course. What are the reasons in the USA? Donald Trump is not the first populist in the USA or in the White House. He is just the biggest and worst populist in US history. We cannot really explore all the reasons of his power here, how he got to where he is now, how long he can keep the position, and how much deeper American politics can go before Trump leaves. Unfortunately, this is a general trend with roots not only in education, but also the way people in the USA and elsewhere are given information. As we were growing up, we used to watch television every day. We watched TV news for about 30 minutes a day on average. And from this mainstream information source, we learned about what is going on in the world. We also had daily newspapers. Now, we can choose media according to our taste and political interests. We decide whom we want to hear or read. And we can fully ignore those we don't agree with. In fact, I do the same. I can't imagine watching Fox News every evening. I would not make it for more than several minutes. It is absolutely impossible for me. It is unacceptable because I don't see it as news. To me, it is propaganda. You could also say that CNN is superficial, too mainstream, and that there are much better news portals than CNN.
veřejnoprávní televize už nemá takovou pozici v Evropě, jak tu a tam.
Nevertheless, the public service media, unfortunately, do not have such a strong position. Not in Central Europe, because commercial TV stations like Markiza in Slovakia or Nova TV in the Czech Republic and others give people what they want. People are not so much interested in analyses. They expect something more superficial. And it doesn't even have to be connected with politics. People love stories about animals, for example, or miss contests. It is very superficial stuff. Then, on the other hand, you have politicians who can take advantage of this. They become popular in a cheap way, using cheap words and targeting a certain part of the population. It is the part of the population that does not read broadsheet newspapers. Often they don't even read any print newspapers at all. Some of them are not even present online. Some of them do not have higher education. They simply accept information from politicians and other mass media sources in a way that is not critical or analytical. It is a pity, but this is how it goes. Marketing and media experts know pretty well how to achieve this. It has roots in advertising for cigarettes and other products. It started in the 1930s and 40s, so it is nothing new. But these days, it is more dangerous and widespread, with a huge effect on society and international relations. We can feel that there is something wrong if a president speaks like someone working in a circus. Instead of serious and meaningful comments, we are given some kind of babbling nonsense and dangerous threats. If such people take power, it is because they were elected by our votes. It is not just technology. You are right, it is also the votes, but it is made possible by the technology. As we mentioned in the previous part, in Central Europe, some people are disillusioned by capitalism, and they are looking for some new apostles of new things. It may sound paradoxical, but could there be anything like this disillusionment in the United States? The USA did not go through socialism. This experience is not present there. But there might be some disillusionment from liberal democracy, even if people are not really aware of that, and they probably would not use these words. From 1969, when Richard Nixon won the US presidential election over Hubert Humphrey, there was a clear attempt to tell lies to the public. Of course, there were lies in politics before, but the political map changed. The South tended to be pro-democratic after the Civil War, and suddenly, after 104 years, they voted for Republicans. Nothing has changed since then in Texas, Mississippi, or Alabama. Now, you can see the differences are like 50-50, with Florida being a special case. But I will not go deeper into details now. There are great parts of the USA where intellectual elites are small. They are in a marginal position, like in Central Europe. And we can see that from World War II, during communism, and after the fall of the regime, there was a huge migration to cities. Now, there are many villages without good schools, and the situation is not favourable for children growing up there. There are not enough peer children, so some villages have no schools at all because of the lack of pupils. So villages often turn into a place where you have your weekend house. This also applies to Slovakia. In the USA, there are regions that used to be industrial areas, with coal mining, for example. With the current unemployment in these regions, people need to move somewhere else. Those people who stay often clearly vote for populists. Votes in Prague are completely different from those in the rest of the country. The same is true for Bratislava and the rest of Slovakia. This is a fact, unfortunately, just like New York, Washington and San Francisco, with different people from those in the rest of the USA. And this evolution is only supported by the internet and social media. When I talk to friends from Ukraine or Belarus, they express their desire for their countries to become part of the West, of the EU and NATO. It is connected with security, peace and a happy life. This applies to many Ukrainian and Belarusian people, in my opinion. In our discussions here, we talked about the attempts to catch up with the West, to compare with these countries, how a similar GDP, to belong to them, may have a side effect. We may be losing something peculiar. This is what we said after 20 years of actually being a part of the West. What is it like for you as Ukrainians and Belarusians to hear such things? It seems to me it is the issue of identity. When you lose your identity, you delegate to a certain big institution a part of your identity. You delegate to Brussels part of your right. On the one hand, it is the reason for this discontent and the rise of right-wing forces in modern Europe. Right-wing populism which prevails in Eastern and Central Europe. At the same time, it seems to me that the country, my country, Ukraine, that is facing a threat, that is under tension. Alhierd has mentioned that Belarus is overshadowed by Russia, and Ukraine is probably the only country which is in direct conflict with Russia, armed conflict. It seems to me that for us, Europe is not simply a choice, but an escape from this shadow. That's why we are considering. A certain part of society considers joining the EU and NATO as the only way to exist. We don't have alternatives. We don't have the third option, an exclusively Ukrainian way. Through transformations, we can become a part of Europe in the long run. By the way, we've lost time, those 27 years which could have been used for Europeanization, joining global institutions. As Alhierd mentioned, we were overshadowed by Russia. Only now we are getting out of this shadow. It seems to me we have no illusions about Europe. We know that nobody waits for us there. We have this understanding, but at the same time, Europe won't make it without us, as we are protecting it from Russia. Probably you can't see it as you live in other contexts. You do not see the coffins. People do not die every day in Europe. It all started from Maidan, where we were protecting the European values, which you do not doubt. It is something you have and nobody can take it away from you. But in 2013, there was an attempt to deprive us of the hope for future. We are fighting for this hope now, and we have no other choice. Only Europe. Only the European values. This is a rather long and difficult path because our country has a post-Soviet society. It experienced historical traumas, passing from generation to generation. We haven't fully worked on our destiny. We have to change as a society. And we do change as a society. Over the last 5 years, we have changed a lot, and you can feel that change. This change comes with an understanding that there is a very big apathy after everything that has happened. We can state that the attention of the world towards Ukraine is not so active as it was before. The world sees Ukraine the same as Belarus. Maybe not the same because there is not this hot phase, no Russian sanctions. Russian-European, Russian-American tension because of Belarus. But it does exist because of us. In the context of all these global problems, we are actually the reason for these problems. Our freedom is a reason for these global shake-ups. On the one hand, probably it is not something we can be happy of, but on the other hand, it puts on us a thankless function. We are like a bargaining chip. We don't know what will happen tomorrow. Ukraine doesn't know that. You do not know what top authorities like Trump and Putin decide. We might be faced with the fact. And that fear that someone can decide something regarding us without us still exists and never disappears. And it makes sense. We will join Europe and accept it as a value, as an institution where everyone must follow the rules. And I can tell it right away that Ukrainians do not like to live by the rules. There is a need to re-educate us. It is not easy to change us, but there is an active part of society, and it is rather big, which understands that there is no other way. And what about Belarus, and also our Central Europeans' fear of losing our identity if we become a part of the West? Would you consider it a threat? Firstly, I think that Belarus is as far from the Europe we're talking about as from the moon. We're afraid to speak of it. Not long ago this week, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belarus made an official statement that Belarus doesn't aspire to join the EU. We don't need that. What we want is to have a good neighbourly relations with the EU. Secondly, we're saying Europe, but what do we mean under it? For me, Europe is heterogeneous. What Europe should we aspire to join? For me, Albania is also Europe. So why should we choose direction for our small, non-influential country? Why the West? Maybe Southern Europe would be better for us. The point is whether Europe is ready to understand us or not. The final question. In 1989, we were really surprised by what was happening, and it was a time of dreams. Some of them were quite naive, but some of them actually came true. Some of them became reality within days, like Václav Havel turning from a dissident to a president within several weeks. We had free elections and a free economy within months. And perhaps within 10 years, our dream to become part of the West also came true. So the dreams were turning into reality, and we were happy. Now, in 2018, I'm wondering if we have any dreams left. What would we do without dreams? Our dream is not to have a Donald Trump in the White House, not to have a Miloš Zeman in the role of the Czech president. We don't want Andrej Babiš to be the Czech Prime Minister anymore, as he may be guilty of fraud. We want such people outside the government. We want a Hungary that is not a country ruled by one party, on one stream of opinions. We want Poland to become a country with real justice. We want Belarus to have its identity and position in Europe. I have been in Belarus several times, and I always went there from Ukraine or Russia. And I always felt, at least in Minsk, like I was in a Russian-speaking part of Europe. It did not feel like Russia for me. It was Europe based on what people were like and the way they treated me. So yes, we can have dreams. But we need to be active. If we are passive, if we do not vote in elections, if we say things don't really matter, and if we become ignorant, we will not be able to change anything. These dreams we had in 1989 were gradually coming true because they were shared by many people. Those you mentioned now do not seem to be a majority desire. They are your dreams and my dreams. Are they realistic? Of course. In the case of the USA, according to the popular vote, Trump got about 3 million votes fewer than Hillary Clinton. In the recent midterm elections, there were 10 or 12 million more people voting for Democratic candidates than those for Republican ones. So I believe these are realistic dreams. despite the electoral college, which does not have the function it used to have. It was meant to correct the mistakes the voters might make. But this applies to the USA. The current situation in the Czech Republic cannot be dealt with unless members of parliament follow the party's discipline instead of their own beliefs. You know more about Slovakia than I do. In Hungary, and perhaps in Poland, there are certain ways that can prevent the situation from returning to the one where it was before the current governments. It could become very complicated. We could see this in Serbia, that put it in its constitution, saying that Kosovo is forever a part of Serbia and this cannot be changed, which is insane. These are examples of crazy and stupid things done by some politicians if they get too much power. This is what they do if they wanted to secure the future they prefer. Naturally, there will be some changes in Serbia and also in Belarus and the Czech Republic as well as in the USA. But it can take some time. I remember that in the early or mid-1980s, during the deep normalization of Czechoslovakia, when Kundera wrote his essay Tragedy of Central Europe, the writer Pavel Kohout, who was exiled in Vienna, spoke to a group of Czech and Slovak refugees. They were people who escaped from communist Czechoslovakia to Austria. They asked him, "Do you think that we will live to see the end of communism in Czechoslovakia?" He answered, "I cannot tell whether it can happen in my lifetime, but as you are younger, you will definitely live to see it." And perhaps 5 or 6 years later, there was this incredible and unexpected change in Czechoslovakia and in Central Europe. We cannot predict. There is no certainty when and how changes will come. It is difficult to understand recent events. For example, people who wrote books about 1989 and the 1990s, they only had some impressions, but no one actually understood what happened. Do you have a Belarusian dream? I probably have to say some nightmares. My personal dream is to make it to a day when this nightmare is over.
І в це слово «дожить» я укладываю такий сенс, щоб побачити на свої очі, коли цей кошмар скончиться.
When you are young, when you are about 20 to 30 years old, it seems that you will definitely see the changes. All your dreams will come true.
Побачиш, так? Некие зміни, що всі твої мари увособилися в життя.
But after 40, you start to doubt that it will happen. That's why I dream of it,
Тому, напевно, ось гэта мне снится, що я
to make it to that day.
дожив.
And a Ukrainian dream?
The biggest dream of Ukraine, at least the part of it which I consider to be independent from Russia,
A free country. A country that will be liberal democratic, respect rights and freedoms, human rights. It seems to me that the main factor that has an influence on our dream sits in the Kremlin. And the things mentioned by my Belarusian colleague about making it to that day, yes, we want to make it to that day when the Kremlin regime falls. We want to make it to the day of the nuclear disarmament of Russia, to the collapse of Russia, because while this country exists, the life of my country, neighboring Belarus, our fraternal country, will be under threat. Those dreams are brave enough. Probably we won't make it to that day, but maybe our children will do that. It seems to me that the hope for a de-Kremlinization should be a key dream. Otherwise, we won't survive. It's a question of our existence, an existential issue. Maybe it's a political dream. Regarding my personal dreams, they do not go beyond traditional dreams people have. I want bombs not to land on my head. I want my relatives to live their lives in peace. I don't want my compatriots to die in eastern Ukraine. These are simple people's dreams.
Andrii Bondar, Alhierd Bacharevic, Jolyon Naegele. Ďakujem, že ste prišli.
Ďakujem.
In the first part, we talked to Central European writers. In the first part, we discussed our fears and whether there is something like the conscience of the people. We talked about the directions our countries are taking, about what we believe and don't believe in anymore. In the second part, we had Ukrainian and Belarusian writers and we talked about dreams. When a Ukrainian journalist listens to this, what are the main impressions? One of the most important things I heard in this discussion is the idea that Central and Eastern Europe needs to be more united. Ukrainians are very West-oriented now. We do know what is happening in France, Germany, the US. We know less about what is happening in Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, even Belarus. An attempt to look at the world from the perspective of Western countries is understandable, but we have to get rid of it. We have to understand our neighbours better. After all, when you start to understand your neighbours better, you leave this zone of provincialism that consists of the idea that you are at the centre of the world and everyone should come and help you. When you are speaking to your neighbours, you're establishing a bilateral dialogue. I'm disappointed by the fact, and the guests have mentioned it, that the relations between Ukraine and Poland, Ukraine and Hungary got more tense. A lot of work has to be done to overcome it. An important thing about Central Europe, but also in other regions, is the rise of populism and politicians who do not honour the truth. Has this trend been seen in Ukraine too? Yes, sure. Ukraine is not an exotic country. Ukraine is developing in the same way as other countries. We have a thing that makes us unique, the war. There are a lot of traumas connected with it. But it doesn't mean that a different logic applies to the processes here than in other countries. Next year, we are having presidential and parliamentary elections. we see a wave of populism coming from all sides, from pro-Russian, anti-Russian forces. Why? Because politics. I don't like the word populism because it has an emphasis on the populace, which means people. There is nothing bad in it. And here we see not populism, but turning politics into marketing. Politicians are studying their audience and offer what people want, not what they suppose is needed. It seems to me, and it works for both the Western and Ukrainian discourse, we position ourselves as weak in comparison with this populism. We don't know what to do with it. It seems to us that we are losing democracy. Liberal democratic ideas should become more aggressive and stronger. There should be an understanding that they are under threat, but they haven't lost the battle. We are in a situation where we don't know what will win in the next 5 to 10 years. Liberal democracy or new authoritarianism. We don't know that. That's why we have to mobilize, become stronger and wiser from the point of view of liberal ideas. In the first part, we tackled something that has been discussed for a long time since the end of communism. There are groups of people who are doing better and whose situation has improved. But for some people, things got worse. They were perhaps too old or in an unfavorable position during the transformation. And these people vote for populists, or those who do not honor the truth. When we talk about this in Central Europe, we act as if there were starving people and masses of those unemployed. But actually, the unemployment rate is lower than ever in our countries. Anytime I come to Ukraine, I feel ashamed. We are complaining, we feel defeated, and thus somehow entitled to vote for populists. But what Ukraine is facing, unlike us, is real misery. A war and a very tough situation, and you are not even complaining that much. Is it because of the situation and the war that you try to improve the situation instead of complaining? I think the reason is, I have already mentioned it, when you see a threat to your existence, you can't act otherwise. You mobilize. Don't have time to complain. You have to act. On the one hand, it is an advantage in the Ukrainian situation. On the other hand, it is a disadvantage. What will happen when the threat disappears? What will happen when it becomes not so obvious? We see that the war in eastern Ukraine is ongoing, but it is not so obvious. It's not so noticeable for people in Kyiv, Lviv, Zhytomyr, or another city. Thus, people are getting back to their everyday life. If you take a look at Ukrainian sociology, you will see that people are concerned about economic problems, no less than about war, sometimes even much more. On the one hand, I clearly understand what is happening in Western European countries, Central European countries. Since there is no threat, a global existential threat to people, you start to focus on everyday economic issues. And such a threat exists in Ukraine. I don't want to idealize Ukrainians. I love my country very much. I am a patriot, but we have to be critical to Ukrainians. Consequences of the upcoming elections of 2019 will be mainly caused not by war, but by economic problems, which began after 2014 as a result of Russian trade war. An economic decline, the decrease of international trade twice. And we see the result. Ukrainians have mobilized during the Maidan events and war. And it doesn't mean that they are angels. They live in a social economic reality and react to it. And the last question. In 1989, we had dreams of what we would like to have. And the reality is that many of them came true. We live in a free society. We vote in free elections. We decide where we belong. Our dreams are coming true, although we are pessimists and skeptical. How about your dreams? The dreams of Ukraine. Have they come true? Are they still the same since the Maidan events? I think yes. There is huge danger everywhere. And I am against the word frustration. In Ukraine, you can also hear that there is some frustration 4 to 5 years after the Maidan events. But why do we have to be disappointed by Maidan? It's not another new film in which the starring actors disappointed you. Maidan is not a new pair of jeans that got ripped and made you disappointed. Maidan is a huge event that made the country move forward. Maybe there will be no simultaneous changes, but anyway, it's an evolutionary movement. Have my dreams since 1991 come true? Yes, they have, but maybe not so fast. I would compare Maidan with the events you had in 1989. That would be the right comparison. We are entering a situation. In 1989, the authoritarian enemy was weaker. We are a bit late, by several years. But the present situation is less favorable. That's why a bit more time will be needed for the fulfillment of our dreams. But Ukrainians have got used to that. Ukrainians are a nation for which combating threats is part of their history. It's a history of living on the verge of the civilized world, and a steppe, nomadic I'd say, has its own culture, but no culture of law. Ukrainians got used to that. They got used to the fact that whether dreams come true or not, they survive. The drama and miracle of Ukrainian history are that despite the fact that there were several attempts to destroy the Ukrainian nation, we survived Holodomor. By the way, tomorrow we are marking the Holodomor anniversary. It's the nation that survives despite all. This is important.
Thank you very much.